apparently there's a story of how the two of you met.
Yes. I think you were working in that movie, Caminho das Estrelas or something.
That's right. In my Luke incarnation. The real story is that I was wandering around somewhere in Portugal and I stumbled across a copy of Bom Dia Camaradas. And I was in Portugal with a research grant to do work on Angola and Mozambique. And this was in my sort of academic, I have various identities. In my first identity, I'm a writer. In my second identity, I'm an academic. And in my third identity, I'm a translator. So in my second identity, I had some money that I had been given very kindly. And I was in Portugal and I read Bom Dia Camaradas. And I was fascinated by various things about it. One was the Cuban connection, and that all appealed to my intellectual academic side. But what appealed to my emotional side was the story of a boy growing up and of growing up in a context of a sort of, I mean, it seems strange to say it because the government was left-wing in Angola, but a left-wing activism. I grew up in Canada, but I grew up with parents who during the 1970s helped American draft dodgers who didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War escape across the border into Canada. And there were various complicated things that had to be done to get them papers legally. So we often had these guys hiding out in our farm while their papers were being processed, or sometimes they had to be smuggled back into the States to get a document and then smuggled back into Canada.
Wow.
And so I grew up in that sort of environment where I was living in a rural area and everybody around us was very conservative, but my parents were involved in this sort of activity. And the narrator of Bom Dia Camaradas spoke to me very strongly in that part of my childhood. And so I became kind of fascinated by the book. Fortunately, I had already booked a trip to Angola with my research grant. In those days, it was harder to get a visa than it is now. But I managed to get one, and I was fortunate to actually be able to visit Ondjaki when I was in Luanda. And I think that was July 2005. That was the first time we met. And he and his father took me fishing on their boat, among other things. But we also did an interview that I published in an academic journal and that sort of thing.
But did we get some fish in that day?
Well, no, it was the wrong time of year, I think. It was July, right? That's not a good time for barracuda. No.
You're fishing back.
Because me and my father, we usually go fishing, not necessarily go and get fish. So we
right. It's an activity.
That's another question, isn't it? That's another. And was that when you decided to translate Good Morning Comrades?
No, that sort of matured over the next year. And in the summer of 2006, I was in Lisbon and I found out that Ondjaki was there, and he was quite busy, but he agreed to have lunch with me, and we went to O Cantinho do Aziz, which is this little Mozambican restaurant up the hill. And in those days, it was completely empty. Now I think you have to make a reservation about 3 days in advance. And we talked about it. I said, I'm working with this translation series and I want to translate it. And so we talked about it a bit, and it wasn't clear it was going to happen. It took a long time for it all to work out. And there had to be negotiations between the publisher I was working for and his agent and so on. But after a few months, we got the go ahead and we started working on it, and little by little it took shape. So so I guess it was 2006 when I actually started working on the translation of Bom Dia Camaradas, and that came out in early 2008. And we did a tour of central Canada in March 2008 in a rented car. Biblioasis was still very small in those days, so we just rented a car and toured bookstores and universities and so on. The tour for Transparent City was a bit more professional. Everybody had gotten a bit more experienced and we had more resources and so on.